So in this video, I want to just briefly talk about a type of therapy, behavioral therapy, called aversion therapy. You may have heard of the idea, even if you don't know the term. Some people who have trouble with nail biting habits will put a really gross tasting nail polish on, so that anytime they do the behavior of nail biting, they get that horrible taste. Others will put a rubber band on their wrist, and when they catch themselves doing an unwanted behavior, they'll snap themselves with the rubber band. Or if you've seen the movie Clockwork Orange, that includes an example of aversion therapy where the ultra-violent teenager Alex is forced into a therapy to associate violence with feeling nauseous. Or there's the famous historical example in early Roman days where Pliny the Elder would help alcoholics by putting spiders in their drinking glasses. So yeah, that's kind of the idea of aversion therapy. Now in this video, I want to explore that idea through a case study with a modern day consumer invention. So for our case study, we'll follow this guy Jerry. So Jerry had been wanting to lose weight for quite some time. He had tried everything from diet pills to joining a gym that he would quit, stop going to after a month, with one failed fad diet after another. He just couldn't give up his junk food habit that he knew contributed to his being overweight. Jerry didn't know what else to do when one day he saw a product called Pavlok featured in a special interest story on his local news. So let's see what this product is about.
This is Chronicle on WCBB Channel 5.
Would 340 volts break your bad habits?
Wow.
Next Gen, next on Chronicle.
Good evening. Tonight we feature innovations you need to know about, potential breakthroughs that could change your life.
And we all know change sometimes can be a little bit hard, so sometimes it takes a jolt to break us out of our bad habits.
We all have our weaknesses, temptations against which we are utterly defenseless. Now comes a shocking development. The Pavlok. 340 volts of wearable willpower.
It's able to help you break bad habits and reduce cravings in about 5 days or less.
Manish Sethi, Pavlok's inventor, says the self-administered shocks condition the user to avoid unwanted behaviors. Nail biting, smoking, and snacking are common applications.
It's similar to if you ever have any friends who drink too much of a variety of alcohol and they can never ever drink that alcohol again. It's exactly the same.
Time for your intrepid reporter to get hooked up.
This will be the level that'll wake you up on time. It'll be the level.
Hi, how you doing?
Yeah.
In my case, it was eating potato chips late at night.
Lalo Lopez of East Boston shared his Pavlok experience real time on social media.
For every bite I would take of the chips, I would shock myself.
Whoa.
And every time I would open the bag and smell it, I would shock myself.
Okay.
Yeah. It was crazy.
After 5 days, Lalo took off the Pavlok, and his cravings went with it.
I've not eaten potato chips at all.
As for my conditioning, I feel powerful neural pathways forming with every jolt.
I'm actually having a negative mental association to you now.
It's okay.
I don't like you slapping me like that. That actually kind of hurts.
Yeah,
but it works, obviously. I liked you before.
I know, now he doesn't like me anymore.
JC wanted to try it. Now, she doesn't have any bad habits she needs to break, but she really just wanted to see how it feels. So here it is. We have it on your wrist. We're going to press it. I get to press it.
So excited. He's so excited to press it.
Press it one time, and it might take a second, and then you'll feel the shock. And so we're trying
Ow! Seriously?
If you had a bad habit, which you don't, biting your fingernails, smoking, whatever, that's a powerful little reminder that maybe you want to stop.
It would help. This would definitely help.
Okay, so news stories aren't exactly known for honing in on the actual science, and they really like to tell exciting stories and use hyperbole without any skepticism. So anecdotes, like seeing a guy who says it worked for him, can be very convincing to people if we don't stop to think it through rationally. So let's consider this a little more carefully. First, what's the theory behind Pavlok? Like, using our terminology, what kind of contingency is being used here, and what behavior is being increased or decreased? What stimulus is being added or taken away? Maybe pause the video for a moment and try and answer that. So this is positive punishment. The behavior is something the person's trying to get rid of, like Jerry's behavior of eating junk food. The stimulus being added afterward is a shock, so it's a contingency, right? Now, pause the video for a moment again, and this time try to brainstorm out a simple study that would convince you of the efficacy of Pavlok to help eliminate Jerry's junk food habit. Now, by the way, excuse me, the inventor here, Manish Sethi, he took his invention onto the show Shark Tank, and he actually got eviscerated by Mark Cuban, who called him a con artist. Sethi claimed his product was backed up by science, but Mark Cuban pointed out no studies had actually been done on Pavlok itself. The guy was just pointing to some really old studies on other forms of aversive conditioning or aversion therapy. Now, while waiting for, let's get back to our case study here. While waiting for Pavlok, his Pavlok device to arrive, Jerry shared the news that he had ordered it with his sister Donna, who just happens to be a psychology professor at the local community college. So as something based on psychological principles, Jerry was sure that Donna would be thrilled with his discovery and be really supportive of his decision to buy it. "Are you kidding me?" remarked Donna. "Why did you waste your money on such a thing?" But stammered Jerry, "I thought you'd be all for it. It's based on what you psychologists do all the time, right?" "Oh, Jerry," she says, "I wish you'd paid more attention in your psychology classes. Using positive punishment like this has so many unpredictable results." "But," Jerry says, "the company website listed some research that shows that aversion therapy can work for losing weight. This abstract here says that individuals receiving the aversion lost and kept off over 9 pounds. So let's look at that abstract he's pointing to. Here's an abstract for a study that Jerry had seen cited on the original Pavlok website. Let's read through it. This study describes an aversive conditioning experiment in which favorite foods, conditioned stimulus, were paired with noxious odors, unconditioned stimulus, to help overweight subjects achieve and maintain weight loss. After the 9-week conditioning period, a significant average weight loss for the experimental subjects of 13.33 pounds compared to an average weight loss of 1 pound for the 6 control subjects was reported. After 48 weeks, the experimental subjects had an average weight loss of 9.1 pounds, while the control group had a weight gain of 1.33 pounds, but that was not significant. The contribution of aversive conditioning to both the initial weight loss and to the maintenance of the weight loss is discussed. So boom, we do have what appears to be, it's a peer-reviewed study, it's published in a scientific journal, seems to show some evidence that aversion therapy will work, will keep off 9 pounds in general. That's great, right? However, Donna was not impressed due to possible confounds that she spotted, and she provided Jerry an abstract by one of the same authors. So a study that was done later by one of the same authors of that earlier 1971 study, where they found very different results. So let's read through the abstract of this follow-up study, this later study. College women volunteers for a weight reduction program were assigned to one of 3 treatment conditions. 12 subjects received olfactory aversion therapy. So that's the same thing we just talked about, like pairing up a really bad smell with their favorite junk food. So 12 subjects got olfactory aversion therapy, while another group of 12 received attention placebo treatment. And then a third group of 14 served as waiting list controls. Now, weight losses over time were statistically significant, but there were no differences among the groups. In other words, aversion therapy didn't work better than doing nothing at all. Also, the weight losses were clinically trivial. It was a tiny amount of weight that didn't matter. And both the aversion therapy and the placebo treatments were considered to be ineffective in the treatment of obesity. So the aversion therapy and the attention placebo groups, those people both downrated the palatability of their favorite, the target foods. They found the experiment to be helpful and sensible, and they claimed reduced food intake, despite not actually losing weight. These subjective reports were discussed in terms of demand characteristics and suggestion effects. So pause the video for a moment and try and jot down what confounds Donna might have identified in that first study that were fixed here in this second study. So pause now and think about it. So I'll come back to those confounds in a moment, but first I want you to consider just based on what you know about positive punishment in general, would you recommend Jerry use Pavlok as it currently is? Why or why not? And is there anything you would change about Pavlok that might make it more effective based on the science you know? So pause the video for a minute here and consider your answers. One thing you might consider is whether Pavlok can fit the criteria for effective positive punishment, the stuff we know from science. Is the intensity high enough without being too extreme? And can we jump straight to that intensity rather than starting mild and gradually increasing? And I think, sure, that at least seems possible, although it might turn out that to really stop bad behaviors, we have to use a shock that is much more painful than anything Pavlok delivers. So we'd actually have to test that and see if it's strong enough to be effective. But what about the last parts, though, that immediate and every time? One issue with a device like Pavlok is the contingency isn't automatic. You have to do a different operant behavior of going and pushing the button yourself in order to get that shock, which makes it less immediate, less directly connected to the contingency, and more consciously controlled, right? It's not a real contingency, and it requires willpower to do it every time, when this is a freaking device to help people who don't have the willpower already. So we should already be a little wary about whether this will be effective, because there's no experimenter there to deliver the shock immediately and every time. Now, if it could be made automated by detecting the behavior and then doing the shock automatically, it might work better. For example, someone I think invented a device kind of similar to detect when your posture slouches and it shocks you automatically till you get good posture going. That at least theoretically could work better. It could theoretically at least serve as effective punishment if it's programmed well. Of course, what's missing here from what we know the most effective use of punishment are all those other things like differential reinforcement, extinction, and response prevention that make punishment work better when they're used together. Also, on top of that, the inventor Sethi didn't consider social disruption side effects. Like, if the shock was strong enough to be genuinely aversive, then we'll likely get some social disruption where users come to dislike the Pavlok wristband itself, in which case they may stop using it or not recommend it to friends. But again, the wristband may not be giving a strong enough shock to actually condition behavior, and the whole thing may be a placebo effect in the first place. So let's talk about those confounds. Here's some details pulled directly out of that 1978 follow-up article that used an improved methodology to study the same thing. They had 3 participant groups. So at the top here, we've got the aversion therapy group. They had their target food paired with a really offensive odor, and they were given this explanation for why this was happening. Your overeating is a learned habit which developed from the association of food with pleasurable sensations. The way to break this habit, to unlearn it, is to substitute unpleasant sensations for the pleasant ones. We know through experience that nothing turns people off of food better than bad odors. For instance, none of you would think of eating decayed meat, spoiled fruit, or sour milk. Here we have a number of specially prepared bad odors which we are going to associate to your problem foods throughout the program. Previous experience has shown that this technique has worked for other people like you, and we're confident it'll work for you too. Are there any questions? Okay, so that's the first group, the people who actually got aversion therapy. Then look at this second group in the middle, the attention placebo group. Let's read through what they heard. So what they were going to do is pair up for them. They paired up their favorite food, the junk food, with pleasant odors. So rather than aversive, obnoxious odors, they had pleasant odors paired up with their favorite food. So here's what they heard. Here's the explanation they heard. Your overeating is a learned habit, which developed as a response to tension. Like many other people, you probably tend to eat extra amounts of food when you're tense and uptight. The way to break this habit is to learn to associate feelings of relaxation with food without actually having to eat the food in order to feel relaxed. We know through experience that very pleasant odors help to produce pleasant thoughts, which counteract the feelings of tension. Here we have a number of specially prepared odors which we're going to associate to your problem foods throughout this program. Previous experience has shown this technique has worked for other people like you, and we're confident it'll work for you too. Are there any questions? So they heard a very similar prompt. They're also being convinced that there's some scientific thing behind what they're about to experience, where an odor is paired up with food. In both of these conditions, an odor is being paired with food. They're being told it'll work. They're being told a scientific explanation that makes some intuitive sense. So both these groups are getting something pretty similar, but one of them we're pairing aversive odors, one we're pairing pleasant odors with their food, right? And then we've got meanwhile, there's a third group. The third group here, the waiting list control group. means people who hadn't yet been given any treatment, so no odor paired with anything. We just followed their weight loss during the same experiment. That way we know if people who seek out these types of studies just tend to lose weight over time anyway, based on the passage of time. It's an additional control against the confound of time. Then, what did they find in this study? From the results, no significant difference among the three groups was found at either post-treatment or follow-up later on. These results are clearly clinically insignificant. In other words, the same person, the same researcher who had told us, 8 years earlier that this aversion therapy works for obesity, now with a better study says, actually, when we tested it better, it doesn't work. It doesn't make a difference. Like, something else is going on here. If there is a difference, it's probably placebo. But even the waiting list group who didn't get the placebo, they also are no different. They didn't have any difference in weight loss from the people who got the real treatment and the fake treatment. And from the discussion here, so same article, just going to the discussion section, I think this is really freaking important. So I want to mention this. New techniques, so starting here, new techniques, including aversion therapy of obesity, tend to yield good results, especially in uncontrolled or inadequately controlled investigations. So we get really excited by new science, something that seems promising. And here the author actually cites his own freaking past studies, criticizing himself like a good scientist. Okay. As methodology becomes more refined, they say, as methodology becomes more refined, the incidence of treatment efficacy declines. Thus, better controlled studies have indicated that aversion stimulation, whether overt or covert, adds little or nothing to other specific or non-specific effects in weight reduction. And just, by the way, non-specific effects is the sciencey term for placebo effects. It means effects not specific to the actual treatment, effects that have nothing to do with the treatment itself, like placebo. So often if you go to journals for complementary and alternative medicine, you'll see they did some kind of like small little study on some treatment, something that's complementary and alternative medicine, and they'll say, oh, we found a statistically significant difference in our treatment group. Except they end up saying somewhere in there, they'll mention, but the effects are non-specific effects, which is a way of saying it's placebo effects. That's usually what, meta-analyses will find for a lot of stuff like that. All right. And if you look at the Wikipedia for aversive conditioning for aversion therapy, you'll see the usual citations to published research on the topic. But you might also notice if you look closely and click those, that it's referring to studies done a long ass time ago. Sometimes like 50 or more years ago. There's some evidence it might work for helping with OCD or hair pulling or nail biting. Like Pavlok was not a new invention. People made a portable shock device like this 50 years before the inventor made his Pavlok wristband. But we don't really have a strong history of good evidence in well-controlled studies showing aversive conditioning working or aversion therapy working. But man, it sounds really convincing when you see someone giving a testimonial saying how the Pavlok worked for them, right? Even in that study where they found no differences in weight loss between the groups, people in both of those treatment groups thought they were eating less and said they found it helpful. They self-reported that they thought it was working. So let's go back to that article for a minute and see what might be happening here. Another plausible proposal to account for subjective changes, in other words, them thinking that it was working, or at least saying that it was working, saying that it was a good treatment. Another plausible proposal to account for those subjective changes following aversion therapy has been cited by blah, blah, blah. Demand characteristics. So Orn has pointed out that once subjects agree to participate in a psychological experiment, they will not only comply with the experimenter's requirements, but they will also tolerate pain, frustration, and even nonsensical interpersonal manipulation in doing so. The psychological experiment becomes a task for the subject to discern the experimenter's hypotheses and to behave in a manner consistent with them. It is proposed that the participants in the present study shared the experimenter's belief that they were involved in an important investigation, and then they sought to comply with perceived experimental demands by downrating the palatability of their favorite foods, even if it wasn't changing their behavior, and by testifying to the efficacy of the technique in the face of objectively poor results. Several subjects, for example, expressed disappointment at their failure to lose weight because of their fear of ruining the experiment. Actual weight reduction was too difficult for most subjects. And this last bit here. Let's read this last bit. It is clear that aversion therapy of obesity is ineffective without some provision for restructuring overall eating behavior as well. It has been noted in studies of laboratory animals that suppression through punishment of a particular response in a response hierarchy will result in an increase in the frequency of the next most probable response in that response hierarchy. So unless correct eating is a highly probable response class in the behavioral repertoire of these obese individuals, then suppression of maladaptive eating behaviors through aversive techniques would not be expected to eventuate in weight loss. In the present investigation, as well as in the covert sensitization parallels to it, other studies, no provision was made to strengthen appropriate eating behavior, and in all cases, the clinical results were poor. In other words, even if aversion therapy works, it doesn't work. Even if you can use shock or a bad smell, or in this case, even a placebo, good smell, to make someone stop eating hamburgers, they will just unconsciously turn to the next junk food in their preference list. That's what they mean by response hierarchy, the kind of things they would turn to. You can make one thing aversive, they'll just go to the next best thing. You're not making them stop junk food in general, just that one junk food. So aversive conditioning doesn't help you create good habits. It just shifts you from one bad habit to the next closest habit in your own response hierarchy. That said, I do want to end this with a mention that there is some strong evidence of aversion therapy working in some specific circumstances related to substance abuse. For example, disulfiram is a medication, a drug that's used in alcohol addiction. So people take this pill, so it's in their system, and then if they happen to consume alcohol, right, if they have a weak moment, a weak day where they turn to alcohol, the alcohol interacts with this medicine, with disulfiram, and it makes them immediately feel really shitty. So the punishment happens immediately and automatically, and it's intense enough to suck. So if the medication is used consistently for a while, this actually can help people. There's likewise some promising evidence with shocks to help quit smoking, though some of those studies are stronger than others. So it's not that aversion therapy can't work. But as we saw with the obesity example, it's easy for low-quality studies to make it seem like something works and has scientific evidence, when really it may just be placebo effects and demand characteristics and other confounds, and it doesn't actually work. So be especially skeptical when someone is choosing which studies to highlight in order to sell you a product. Somehow I don't think the Manish Sethis of the world are going to also share the follow-up studies that debunk that earlier work, the same way our scientist, John Forate here, in those two studies we saw, was willing to call out his own previous lower quality work and come to the opposite conclusion when he had better data. That's how science should work. It's more interested in truth than in making money. But inventors and investors are more interested in making money. And even if they're well-intentioned and they want their products to work, they think their products work, their own cognitive biases are going to make them overinterpret and overhype any minor evidence supporting their product and kind of ignore or miss or not seek out disconfirming evidence that undermines their product. That's why this basic science research needs to be done.